Okay, I'm just going to introduce David. David, welcome.
Thank you.
This panel session, Measuring Impact Beyond Spend. David is a principal at Vantage Partners. He's a specialist in a range of business disciplines, including procurement, supply chain, alliance management, sales, marketing, and my favorite, thought leader in supplier cybersecurity.
That sounds very, very grand, doesn't it? But as we all know, suppliers are a huge cyber threat. So there's a lot of developing thought in that area that's interesting for a lot of folks, I think. Yeah,
and supply chains are particularly vulnerable, aren't they, to that type of threat?
Correct. I'm sure most of the folks on the line have probably seen, it's virtually a daily occurrence to read now about a cyber attack, and over 80% of those cyber attacks are coming from suppliers. And what we find with the work that I do with the CEO of a supplier cybersecurity organization is that we so often forget that the supplier is the route into your organization for a hacker or a cyber terrorist. And cybercrime is relatively undetected in a lot of areas, but when it does happen, catastrophic for many organizations. So as supply chain leaders, worth remembering, we should be measuring the cyber risk profile of the suppliers that we work with. And that doesn't mean you get them to tick a sheet that says, yes, we're cyber secure. Not good enough. It means you put some technology in to really analyze the threat that that supplier poses to you. Anyway. A subject for another day, I'm sure.
Welcome. So welcome to David, and over to you, David, to welcome our esteemed panelists today.
Wonderful, Simon. Thank you so much. And welcome, everybody. Pleasure to be with you for this next session in the Knowledge Forum today. So, yeah, I've got a pleasure to introduce our panel today. We're going to talk about the concept of measurement. We're going to think about how we can measure impact beyond spend when it comes to diversity. So a few questions for the team on those topics. And as always, if possible, if you want to ask questions, hopefully you can find the Q&A button on your Zoom screen, and feel free to drop a question in there if you can, and you raise a hand. I will do my best to see that hand raised and try and get to you. But in the first instance, we're going to just hear from the panel on a few select questions, and then I'll open up the floor for any additional questions as time allows. So if I could ask panel to introduce themselves. The first member of the team I'd like to introduce is Deaneesha Govender from Intel. Hey, Deaneesha, would you like to say hi to everybody, please?
Hi, thanks.
Hello, thank you, and thanks for joining. And then we have Susan Chu from Standard Chartered.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel session. It's great to have the opportunity to discuss some of these really important themes, and obviously measurement is a really key one. So yeah, great to be here.
Wonderful, Susan, thank you. And then next from the cart, we've got Rebecca. Rebecca, say hi to everyone, please.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everybody, or morning, depending on where you're joining us from. I know there's lots of international people on here too. Yeah, just as the others have said, really, really honoured to be here, in fact, because we are right at the very beginning of our supplier diversity journey. So really keen to see what the other panellists have got to say, really around measurement and any successes that they have that they'd like to share with us, to be honest. So,
wonderful, Rebecca. Thank you very much. And last but absolutely not least, Krystle from Facebook.
Thanks, David. Yeah, as everyone said, really happy to be here. Looking forward to a really good discussion on metrics.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so here's a proposition, something to start us off with just in terms of the thought. And the proposition might look like this, that developing scorecards to measure areas beyond just spend and to actually measure a socio-economic impact and demonstrate the effect of supplier partnering with diverse suppliers is a powerful tool for increasing stakeholder buy-in. So measurement beyond spend and the concept of using some metrics beyond spend that measure other areas of socio-economic impact can be a very powerful tool when we think about stakeholder buy-in. So let's look at the first question underneath that proposition. So we all know that supplier diversity metrics have fundamentally and for a long time been stagnated around the concept of spend and how much do you spend with a diverse supplier or range of diverse suppliers. And of course, that has lots of challenges. One of which, of course, is if you have a supplier with whom you spend a lot of money, that disproportionately affects how your overall spend profile might look like, for example. What other areas, though, of measurement do you think we should be looking at when we think about that broader socio-economic impact? So let me, maybe Susan, can we start with you? What do you think on that one?
Obviously, it's a really important consideration, but equally, you know, a challenge. And I think that it brings us right back to what we've already been discussing today and some of the key themes in terms of purpose. So I think like a really well-defined purpose will help us, you know, and lead us to what we should be measuring. Because I think that, you know, if we go to the great extent of defining a purpose and then engaging the organisation to that purpose, we then have to follow that through in terms of measurement of how we're actually achieving that purpose. And, you know, obviously supply diversity and supply chain is a really key part of that. So at Standard Chartered, for example, you know, we have spent a lot of time doing that. So our overall business purpose is to, you know, to be here for good and to be the best bank for our employees, our clients, and also our communities, and, you know, driving prosperity through our unique diversity in a sustainable way. So, you know, they're great words and it is a great ambition, but, you know, we need to, you know, ourselves internally face the challenges of how we demonstrate that we're actually realizing that purpose. And, you know, that is a business-wide responsibility. So I think the first thing is, you know, define the purpose and then engage your organization around that purpose. I think, you know, the challenge in terms of moving from traditional metrics to more, you know, purpose-driven, value-based metrics requires us to not assume that key stakeholders will just switch their focus. You know, we really need to put a lot of input into really driving their understanding, engagement, and ultimately accountability for, you know, developing, accepting, and driving those measures that are directly linked to that purpose.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you. Rebecca, if I can kind of toggle that same question to you and perhaps add to that. So do we think spend is an obsolete metric when we think about this, or does it still have a place, do you think?
I think it's a really tricky one, isn't it? Because I think as procurement professionals, we're sort of hardwired to focus on spend and numbers and number of suppliers and how much do we spend with this supplier, etc. It's hard to move away from that completely, but something that we're sort of grappling with is broader than the supplier diversity piece, is how do we measure the impact of all of our sort of, excuse me, all of our all the social things that we're doing around helping our community from a social value and a shared value perspective. How do we measure that, and how do we sort of look at measuring our suppliers in that space, and how do we look to see what difference are we actually making as an organisation? Because we're right at the beginning of our journey, as I've talked about already, and we don't actually have any specific targets in place to talk about how many suppliers we want to work with from a diverse background or how much we want to increase our spend. A couple of reasons for that. One is because what's the right answer and what impact is that having? As you alluded to at the beginning, if you've got a massive contract with one diverse supplier that can completely skew your entire metrics, would you be having a better impact if you worked with several? Would you have more of an impact if it was targeted in communities that, you know, were maybe traditionally underrepresented? Or, you know, would it be better if it was a supplier who provided a social value service, like encouraging more apprentices from certain backgrounds to join and work with the co-op? So we haven't actually done that yet. The other challenge with that, of course, is the one that everybody has, which is measuring that baseline. You know, how do we get a really good handle on throughout our entire supply chain how many diverse suppliers are we working with and what's the definition of that. But I think you also mentioned about bringing stakeholders on the journey, and one thing that we're quite fortunate at the co-op, and Susan's mentioned this already, is we've got a really clear purpose and vision. So our vision is cooperating for a fairer world. And in line with that, last I think it was sort of September time, our CEO, Steve Morels, came out and made a really strong statement that the co-op was going to be an overtly anti-racist organisation, and backed that up with a series of public commitments that were very, very specific, very, very measurable, that flowed all the way down through the organisation. We have a couple of those that are specifically linked to our procurement practices, to our supplier management approach. We've tried to embed those so that we can change those processes and actively make a difference. The measurement side, though, as I say, is a bit trickier, but I'd really love us to get to a place where we understand not only how many suppliers are out there that are diverse within our entire supply chain, tier 1, tier 2, and maybe even beyond, but actively what impacts are they having on the community and what difference are we making to people's lives by opening the doors as wide as possible. Yeah,
I think that's right. Yeah, interesting. Krystle, over to you. Facebook, slightly less traditional organization, of course. So, curious to your thoughts around where metrics sit generally, actually, but particularly as we think about the challenge of, do we need to broaden the metrics to appeal to a larger community of stakeholders internally and even arguably externally? Or is the concept of measurement generally a little bit of an old-fashioned thing? What would you think?
Well, echoing a lot of what Susan and Rebecca have just said, I think it does come back to a really strong strategy and vision of what you want from the programme. And you can take it in a number of different ways. I think, repeating a lot of what's been said, but we're all wanting the programmes to be more than just adding on suppliers to our ecosystem. We want to make social and economic impact. And so for me, one of those ways, and how you measure it is still kind of a blue sky thinking of how do you kind of capture this, is getting that diverse representation into decision making and influence roles. So business owners are a start, because they're the people and they're the organizations that are driving our community. They are having an impact in our economy. They have an impact on our political landscape. And I think I'd love to get to a position where we're able to see what that impact is. And MSD UK have done the reports. But how can we measure that in a really tangible way, kind of going forward, and kind of taking the work that Mayank has done and seeing more from that. The other area that our stakeholders want more insight in is the economic impact and the social impact that diverse suppliers have in their own communities. So looking at the diversity of the people that they're employing, the innovation that they're bringing. Some of those are easy to measure, jobs creation and diversity within your own staff base is an easy one to measure. Innovation, I think we can definitely get there, but you really need the stakeholder buy-in to kind of align with what's the business strategy and how does that diversity of thought really drive innovation in that individual space. So I think just really echoing a lot of what Susan and Rebecca have already said.
Thank you, and thanks for that. Deaneesha, Intel, what does a good scorecard look like, do you think, for Intel, particularly again as we think beyond spend, about inclusion, about socioeconomic impact, about other sustainability metrics?
So I think, we work off a methodology. I think there's this assumption in the industry that, diversity is separate to your standard supplier report cards. And the reality in practice, especially at Intel, is, we look at a scorecard from a holistic perspective. We look at things like cost, quality, availability, technology, sustainability, and diversity. But when you look at specific KPIs and metrics, what we generally tend to do is you will have separate matrix, right? Within procurement, we have one overall matrix across direct and indirect procurement, right? And each of those different, what we term as towers, would have a specific target. And again, that comes back to the number, right? The spend that you have with diverse suppliers. Then you have your stakeholders, right? So Susan mentioned earlier, you have to bring your stakeholders on the journey. If you need to hold them accountable, you'd need to be able to say within your business, here's a number, can you achieve that? So scorecards are not very complex, especially within diversity. But I think that we need to look beyond just spend, right? We need to see how that dollar impacts the communities, and we need to be able to track from the spend that you've had with diverse suppliers, how it reaches those communities. And that's much easier said than done.
That is actually hard to say as well, actually, when you really think about it. So what you're saying is we need a way to track the dollars we spend, however we spend them in a diverse supply network, with what direct impact does that dollar have on the communities, as well as the suppliers in those communities that we might engage with.
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. That's going to be extremely challenging, isn't it? But feels like the purposeful piece that we were hearing from earlier. What impact? And I think Kai said it in the main CPO session as well. What direct impact are we having, and what's the purpose that we're driving to have that impact? And therefore, I guess where you're going then is, how do we think about what the measurement of that could be and could look like?
And I think it's also about driving diversity down the entire value chain, right? So what we tend to do is, a lot of the organizations, especially big corporates, they tend to invest with holding companies. Holding company agencies don't generally, or suppliers don't generally have, diversity. So what we try to do is we try to build a tier 2 diverse program. And so what we do is we work with these prime suppliers who are holding companies, and we try and get them to build their own supply diversity initiatives. And so what we do is we're able to get them to report those numbers back to Intel, and we're able to count those dollars. That's standard industry practice.
Okay. Do you have within Intel, understanding what you're measuring with your towers and your procurement organization, do you align your metrics though also to other internal functional metrics, like a CSR function or something like that?
Yeah. So we have a program that's called RISE. So Intel, as part of the RISE program, it incorporates things like sustainability and diversity. It's a corporate-wide program. It's a statement that says by 2030, we need to
Deaneesha,
spend $2 billion with. So can you hear me clearly?
Yeah, we're losing you. You've hung a little bit there, I'm afraid. Yeah, okay. Can we come back to Deaneesha? I think we've got
can you hear me now?
I can hear you, but your picture is freezing. So let me come back to you on that point, because I think it's an interesting one to pick up. And perhaps we'll see if your system will pick up for you. Let me shift back to Susan if I can. Susan, the many factors to try and think about measurement in. How do we go about thinking about conversion rates? How many diverse suppliers actually win business? How much are we actually, recruiting or engaging or promoting the supplier diversities? Not just because there's a metric that says we put one diverse supplier in an RFP program, but actually the conversion rate, the success factor, if you like.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really good point. And one of the things that, in terms of trying to build the understanding, of supply diversity and how actually to facilitate it within an organization, one of the things I say to our stakeholders, it's not just about setting an end goal target that says, by the end of the year or by the end of the month, we want to have, a 5% increase in numbers or spend of diverse suppliers, because that really doesn't give a full view in terms of, what's going on and how successful we are and where our own blockers are potentially in the process. So one of the things that that we've started to do in Standard Chartered is to map all of our touch points, you know, in terms of the beginning right to the almost the end of the process, is that uplifting target. So from the minute we almost start thinking about supply diversity, to then issuing RFPs, to then, our selection criteria, through to our onboarding processes. And then also in terms of nurturing those relationships, how we build relationships and, develop, more work and benefit with diverse suppliers. And I think it is just as important at each of those touch points to be able to understand where diverse suppliers drop out. So one of our bold stands is lifting participation, but I think it's equally important to understand where are we limiting participation, throughout that process. And once we get a good handle on that for each of those touch points, we then can start to address, the real issues and, and the real hurdles. And I think some of them are common to, lots of organizations. So, challenges with diverse suppliers being overwhelmed, in the RFP or the onboarding process and so on. But I think it's different, than just kind of generally knowing that, to actually having, a real view on the journey that say, they were doing okay here and they got through the RFP, but they just couldn't cope with the onboarding process and they dropped out. To understand that will really help leverage some real change.
It's interesting to look on the negative flip side, isn't it? We're also keen to measure everything that's going well and how well we're all doing, and we like charts that kind of go that way. But actually, what you've really got to question what you're measuring and why are you measuring it. And one of the reasons we should be measuring is to highlight where we need to do better and what things are stopping us doing better, and turn it into that inflection point that says, how do we then take that internally and do something better so that the scoring gets better, rather than just always look to seek that nice increasing chart of performance, as it were. Do you think that's right?
Exactly. I mean, and a lot of our plans, when I look at our markets that have, supply D&I plans, and, I often get involved in reviewing those, what I really like to see when they're setting their objectives, that they have an understanding, of where those limitations to lifting participation are. And they're really developing some local actions to drive change. I think that's really important, that understanding of what needs to be done to enable the achievement of a target. For me, and I think that, many of us are emerging, in our supply diversity strategies. I think that's even more important, at the beginning of your journey, that you start it in that way.
Yeah, agreed. Deaneesha, hopefully you're back with us. Sorry, we moved on there. You were talking to us about your RISE program, and we were thinking about linkage to other parts of the organization. Sorry, it'd be lovely to hear a little bit more about that if we could.
Perfect. So can you hear me clearly now?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Oh, okay. It says my connection is unstable, but I'm going to go for it.
Let's go for it. Come on.
Yeah. So our RISE 2030 goal is something that was set by our CEO. It was communicated across the organization, and it looks at things in a number of areas. One is obviously sustainability and sustainable materials that we use to manufacture our product. The other was inclusion, and inclusion looked at both internal inclusion of how we develop our diverse community within Intel and how we get them to grow, and how we open up opportunities at higher positions for those individuals. And then it looked at supply diversity. And with supply diversity, the goal that they've set there is very ambitious. And that goal is we have to spend $2 billion with diverse suppliers by 2030, right? And so when we say annually, that means 2 billion every year. That's the target. I think we're currently tracking to about 1.2, 1.3 billion per year, right? We hit our 1 billion a year target a year ahead of schedule. And I think we see the success of it, and we believe that we can continue to grow that opportunity, but we can't do it alone, right? And it's very difficult to work with individuals who have a preference for suppliers, whether diverse or non-diverse, to get them to move towards, growing a diverse supply base. And so what you find is we have country champions across the board in supply diversity. We're currently in 22 international markets. I am the country champion for the UK and South Africa. And what I have to do is I have to make sure, we've embedded in our policies that every bid that we take to market has to include a diverse supplier. It's within the procurement policy. We have set up a Power BI dashboard to actually look at all the bids that were taken to market, and we can see which of those bids excluded diverse suppliers. People need to now justify within procurement why they did not include a diverse supplier. And so with that, what we're doing is the country champions are tasked to go and educate all of the folks across procurement, go and understand what's on their roadmap of activities, work with the NGOs like MSD UK to identify suppliers that we could include, and then help them continue to grow the spends with suppliers. So we've set a whole process in place. Our diversity journey is about 20 years in the making. We initially launched in the US in 1998, but in the international market, we launched in 2008. And so, we've come a long way. We've already embedded it in our supplier report card processes. We are encouraging prime suppliers to start spending any pass-through dollars with diverse suppliers. We introduce them to the NGOs. We get them to sign up to become members of these NGOs so they can build their own supply diversity program. So again, it comes back to how do you drive it down the entire value chain? Yeah. Plus, how do you get everyone within your organization on that journey?
Yeah, excellent. Thank you so much, Deaneesha, and good we've got you back there. That's really, really useful. Krystle, if I can perhaps jump back to you. We've got to think beyond our own organizations in terms of measurement, most likely, right? And therefore we can get into the whole realm of tier 1, tier 2 supplier and not only measuring that for ourselves, but actually insisting that they also measure their suppliers and their supply chains. Do you think we have a responsibility to do that as procurement leaders and procurement professionals? Do you think we should be encouraging them to be mirroring effectively, our behaviors in their own supply chains and managing that? And should we measure that?
Yeah, I think we have a responsibility to act as role models and to kind of set that benchmark of what does good look like in this space. Our supply chain and value chains really need to reflect our values and the standards of the companies that they're working with. These extended supply chains are just as important as the tier 1 suppliers that we're working with, and it's all about driving that mass impact and really moving the needle, and we can only do that in partnership with our supply chains. So we have that ability to make that positive change. I think we also need to, as Deaneesha mentioned, act as those facilitators and encourage and introduce tier 1 and tier 2, and perhaps tier 3 suppliers, and get them talking and sharing information, sharing supplier contacts, and just making those introductions as well, and really pushing this down. We're all in it together, and we all need to step up and make that change. So I think we don't have a scorecard as such with our suppliers, but what we do set is that when we're going through our RFP process, we are asking questions more broadly than just about ownership, but about our suppliers, supply diversity programs, more broadly about their D&I programs within their organizations. And I have to say, one of the biggest things that we always feed back on is, you don't have a supply diversity program, please put in, please consider a supply diversity program. And it has been really successful. We have seen that change by asking those questions and by saying this is important to us. Our suppliers realize that it's important, and have reached out. I think I've been on so many phone calls with suppliers who've really wanted to understand, well, how do we do our supplier diversity program? How can they do that? Who do they need to connect with? And everybody knows in the supply diversity community, that's a lot of what we do, is connecting with other people to talk about and sharing ideas and partners to engage with. So there's a lot of, I've felt a lot of that in the last year, where suppliers have been really actively engaging in those conversations. And it's in a couple of the RFPs that we've done, that has been a primary driver of the selection of who we've gone with. Did they have a supplier diversity program, and how seriously do they take diversity and inclusion? So it does have an impact with stakeholders.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that selection criteria, I'm kind of curious about. Rebecca, you were saying at the Co-op about your CEO's really strong anti-racist stance, for example. Do you see a day when you might be pushing suppliers away if they don't mirror some of your high expectations in these areas?
Just come off mute there. Yeah, absolutely. I think we probably aren't too far away from that day, and it's not just from a supplier diversity perspective, it's from an ethical trade perspective, it's from a sustainability perspective. What are your carbon net zero plans? Will we do business with you if you don't have one in place? It's all going to be considered, I think, on that sort of supplier selection process just as highly as technical competence and pricing. Back when I was sort of doing a bit more buying than I do now, I remember the scorecard for kind of ethics, I think it was probably called, or CSR, was probably 5% of the selection criteria. I don't think we're in that place anymore. I think it's much higher, and I think that from a really practical perspective, particularly for us at the Co-op, the reputational damage that could come with working with a key supplier who isn't sharing our values and isn't living those values would be horrific, and we wouldn't want that, and we wouldn't want to be associated with that kind of supplier. And I think what's even more important as well is that they continue to live those values and continue to demonstrate that. So if they've come over that hurdle of, yes, you've been selected, we're comfortable that you've got all the right things in place, how do we then maintain that relationship via our supplier management program? Particularly with those key suppliers that we're doing supplier relationship management with, how do we get under the skin of what's really going on? It's not enough, as Krystle said, to say, yes, I have a supplier diversity program, or yes, I've got a diversity and inclusion policy, but what are you actually doing, and what can you share with us?
Yeah.
And that's another great point. We are at the beginning. We don't think we have all the answers. We're not arrogant enough to go to all of our suppliers and say, do it our way. We're sort of saying, well, what are you doing, and what can we learn from you? And we've found it's a really good two-way conversation to sort of learn from what our suppliers are doing. But equally, we do have some suppliers that say, thank goodness we're having this conversation, because we're years behind you. So even if there's anything you can share with us on appropriate language, or anything that isn't directly related to supplier diversity, but it's more around how do we recruit in an inclusive manner, or how do we make sure that our colleagues feel empowered to be themselves at work from an inclusion perspective. We might have some things that we can share there too. But I think supplier management has been absolutely key in sort of trying to make this work. If we didn't have that supplier management ongoing relationship with our suppliers, this would be a really hard conversation to have if you're not already meeting them on a monthly or quarterly basis.
Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you. Susan, if I can jump back to you, just building on a couple of things that came into my mind there. You're in a highly regulated industry. Do you see regulators ultimately stepping in and having a role here, or maybe insisting on degrees of measurement that we don't currently have? Do you think that's something likely in industries like yours?
I mean, absolutely. But I think it is possible, when we talk about bringing stakeholders, with us in the journey, I think that, the regulators and the risk controls, that are applied also need to, reflect and consider our purpose and the journey. So I do think that, one of the common challenges that is put forward when you're trying to, develop greater supply diversity is, how can we possibly do that with our risk agenda? Even it's not possible. So I think that it's about collaboration, it's about understanding. It's certainly not about creating more risk, inappropriately, but I do think there is an opportunity to balance the way that we look at risk traditionally, and how we measure that with the the business purpose of trying to, you know, lift participation, you know, obviously our sustainability goals and so on. So I think risk and measurement plays an important part, but I think it, you know, there is a need for that to develop and change, you know, with this renewed focus on the need to achieve a renewed purpose that, you know, and we've had that change. And I think I would reiterate a lot of the points that, you know, the team have made. I think really key to this, you know, is collaboration. You know, it's not about having a big stick, you know, to beat people with, whether it's internal stakeholders or external suppliers. I think it is about being clear, you know, and having clarity about, you know, what we are aiming for. And, you know, that we have clear goals, and that does translate into metrics. But we're also clear about the support that we will give to enable that alignment and delivery of those metrics. So, for example, within Standard Chartered, we've been very explicit in saying and given clarity that we want to evolve our supply chain to only work with either diverse owned suppliers or larger suppliers that have either an equal or stronger approach to supply diversity as Standard Chartered Bank. And but in putting that clear kind of statement out, you know, we have issued our standard, and in a very collaborative way, we're looking at issuing a toolkit in terms of how you can align to that standard. And I think that's really where you break down the boundaries between the internal and the external culture that we're all trying to aspire to and develop.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that reporting and the metrics, the regulatory requirements for reporting can often drive behavior. You know, we see with, say, you know, gender pay gap reporting, for example, you know, the starting of that process probably had a lot to do with the change that then has to happen in terms of the equality of pay. But I hear you, and I'm just picking up on a comment Giles has made on the chat. That he says, I get very nervous when I hear about scorecards because I worry they will follow the typical direction of KPIs and become resource heavy. How do we design usable scorecards that deliver benefits? Is it less about scorecards and more about getting the company culture right? Maybe any last thoughts from anybody before we look to wrap up today? Thanks for the comment, Giles.
I mean, I do, you know, we've got that same challenge at Standard Chartered, and I do think it's about balance. You know, it really is. It's, you know, quite often come across, if you like, key stakeholders that are either one or the other, but it really is about both. And, you know, because they are both important. I think that when you go right back to the purpose, and I think that's a really good kind of, if you like, brings everybody down to earth and, you know, back to the central focus. And for me, if it's about lifting participation, economic participation and so on, it does challenge us to review our traditional ways of doing things and be more open and innovative to new ways.
Wonderful.
And I think just two quick things for me. I think
thanks, Deaneesha.
One on the scorecard, you're right, it is time intensive, and that's why we don't have a separate diversity scorecard. We included diversity as a section within our standard scorecard. So typically we don't have a separate one. The second thing, and I think is critically important about driving diversity down to a community level, is spending time educating, you know, diverse suppliers through workshops that we regularly host. So some of the workshops that we've done is, you know, one was very much focused on unconscious bias, but I did one that was focused on how to respond to RFPs, right? So growing and developing their skill set, not only within how to respond to RFPs, but, you know, within their business area, bringing them and aligning them to senior leadership within the organization that can talk them through, you know, a vision, mission, how to build and grow a business. That's critically important.
Wonderful. Thank you. Guys, we are up on time, but please let me just say my thanks once again to the panel today. Thank you for giving us your thoughts and your insights. It's been great hearing from you. Pleasure to see you and to talk to you again. So thank you very much. And for those joining, thanks for joining us. And we hope we'll see you at one of the other sessions today or tomorrow. Thank you.
And thank you, David, for hosting and moderating. Thank you to all of the panelists and the attendees. If you would like to join us now back on the main stage where the last rounds of the Innovation Challenge are taking place, and at 5:15, the awards. We've all been waiting for this today. So please do join us for that on the main stage. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Imam.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.